Hello, everyone. We are glad to have you joining us today. And let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Fernanda Castillo, Education USA advisor located in the state of Puebla, Mexico. Before we start, I kindly ask you to stay muted and with your camera turned off. If you have any questions, please address them to me. And remember that if you would like to have access to this information again, you can find the recording in our YouTube channel, Education USA Mexico. And next, please. Our topic for today is how to excel on the SAT and ACT exams. And today we have with us a very special guest from Canada, Jenika Heim, who will be presenting today after this brief presentation. So for those who are not familiar with Education USA, next please. We are a global network of advising centers from the US State of Department, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. We have 26 Education USA centers around Mexico, and we offer free access to introductory information on US studies. Our target are students, higher education institutions, government, and NGOs. For those who are not familiar with Education USA, what we actually do is if you plan to pursue a short-term or a full degree program in the United States, we help you with all of this process. So please reach out to us because we are the official source of information. And next, please. So today's subject fits into what we call the 5 steps to study in the United States. And the first step is to research your options. Here you can learn about the variety of options available and how to identify an institution that best fits your needs. The second step that we have is how to finance your studies. If you need funding, you can explore options or check out our university lists and aid opportunities. The third step is to complete your application, where you can plan ahead and know the documents and requirements that you need to apply for the program. In this case, we're going to see a little bit of this step. The fourth step is to apply for your student visa, where you become familiar with your US student visa requirements and allow plenty of time to prepare your application. And the final step is to prepare for your departure, where we help you with a pre-departure orientation, where we include information about gathering documents for arrival and immigration compliance. And now, without further ado, I will pass you over my colleague, Jenika Heim.
Thank you so much. All right, next slide, please. So I look forward to speaking to you today about the SAT and ACT and how they're used in the US admissions process. And we're gonna go into best ways to study. There's gonna be a lot of information today, so do feel free to ask questions along the way. I believe Fernanda said that she is going to be taking the questions. So if you want to send her a direct message, she can cultivate those. I'm happy to, if people are able to type in the chat, I'm happy to receive questions in that space as well. Next slide. So as promised, we have a packed agenda. This is what we're going to go over today. Take notes, ask questions. Next slide. And one more. First and foremost, some of you might not be familiar with what the US admissions requirements are. So this is just a brief overview of some of the things you may be required to submit when applying to US universities. Every university will require an application and a fee, and those fees can range between 30 to 85 US dollars. Every university will require transcripts from your high school or wherever it is that you have gone to school most recently. If you're a transfer student, that would also include your higher education. Standardized tests. So some schools may require an SAT or ACT, and if English is not your first language, you most likely will also submit an English proficiency exam, such as a TOEFL or IELTS. And then the bullet points after that, it really just depends on how selective the institution is on whether or not they may have these certain requirements. So some schools may require some letters of recommendation from your teachers and or your guidance counselor. You may need to write an essay or some additional supplements about why you want to study a particular major or go to the certain school that you're applying to. You may be required or given the option to have an interview usually with an alumni from the university. And if you're in the arts, you may need to submit a portfolio or an audition, depending on if you're in the visual arts or the performing arts. And lastly, you may also be able to include some additional optional materials like a resume. So there's a lot of things, which is why Education USA is here to help you and help you sort out which of these requirements you may need to be completing for your universities of choice. Next slide. The US has, most schools have what's called a holistic process to admissions. So really the more things a university requires from you, the more holistic their process is going to be. So that was a pretty long list you saw on the previous page. And a school that has all of those requirements or options is typically going to have a fairly holistic process where they look at all of the things that you submit and make a decision, a holistic decision from there, which means that, there's typically no one thing that would kind of throw out your application. Everything is reviewed. So in that holistic process, standardized tests are just one piece, but they're not the most important piece. But you'll find that they are the only standardized measure you're submitting, which is why some schools have kept them. And we're going to talk more about that in an upcoming slide. Something I like to point out is because students will usually have the question, what's a good score? And so the answer to that is a good score matches your academic profile and the profile of the school that you're looking to get into. So you can use the collegeboard.org. You can type in the name of any university that you are interested in, and you can find the middle 50% range of not every school, but most schools in the United States. Some don't give the information. So middle 50% means, 25% or below, 25% or above. I think when people look those scores up, sometimes they're surprised. As you can see here, I think some people think to get into Harvard, you have to have a perfect score at 1600. But as you can see, the middle 50% have gotten somewhere over a 1460. A 1460 is still a very strong score. It's over the 90th, or I think it's around the 95th percentile. So it's still a very, very high score. But I think students assume that the most selective colleges demand perfection, and that's simply not true. And so I just gave a few sample ranges here just to give you a sense of what those middle 50% would be for an SAT or for an ACT. And this can help you. So in the search process, this can really help you find good fit schools, because let's say you're like, okay, I took an SAT, I got a 1290, and I've been looking at University of Texas. Is that a good score? And you can see it's really right in their range, and you can feel comfortable that you're on track with your scores for a school such as that. Next slide, please. So right now, SAT, ACT, while in the past, a lot of schools required it, particularly really selective institutions. It was one of kind of the hallmarks of applying to US schools that you had to take an SAT or an ACT. Right now, due to COVID-19, a lot of schools are test optional. And now, of course, just know that when I made these slides, I made them a couple weeks ago. So I'm even going to have everything's updating day to day, basically. So I can tell you that more than I believe it's 1450 plus universities, it's close to basically 2/3 at this point, are going to be test optional for the next admission cycle. So that means if you are going into grade 12 next year and you're applying to US universities, for 2/3 of universities, they do not need you to submit an SAT or ACT score. So, you might get through all this information today and say, you know what, I don't even need to do this. I'm good to go without it. That's totally fine. But 1/3 of schools still are requiring an SAT or an ACT. And that means that if you're not sure where you're applying yet, you might still be considering taking this test to make sure that it's keeping all your options open. So definitely take a look at university websites to see what their most recent policy is. The website fairtest.org does a really good job of, it has a search database where they are keeping up to date with who is test optional for this next cycle. A couple of also important pieces of information, recent discontinuations from the College Board, and College Board is the name of the organization that gives the SAT. So the SAT used to have an essay, and that is now discontinued since January, or that's when they discontinued it. The last test that gave it was in May. So that's done. And then the SAT subject tests have also been discontinued. So we're not going to talk about those at all. If you see any reference to SAT subject tests when you're looking through admissions books and things like that, it's probably an older edition. Just know that SAT subject tests are no longer going to exist. So it's definitely not something that you need to think about taking. And then English language tests, a big change since COVID-19 is now they're widely available online. So English language tests, absolutely need to take those if English is not your first language. And it's now can be easy to access if you have the tools available on your computer. So those are the big changes around COVID-19. I think what students will often ask is, well, if a school is test optional, do I need to take an SAT or ACT? The answer is no. Your option could be no, and that's totally fine. When anytime something is marked as optional in the US admissions process, you do not need to submit it. You can choose whether or not you think it's going to be a good benefit to your overall profile. I know here in Canada, we've had very low access to these exams because of COVID. In some cities, they haven't run SATs for I think the last one that was available was sometime last fall. So it's been a really long time, or even then, maybe it was even before COVID. So there's some locations where students couldn't take it at all. I'm not sure, in your area, what the access is like. So that's going to be up to you on whether or not, first, you can even access tests, and second, if it's worth it to you. Next slide. And next slide. So we will start with just giving a brief overview of the PSAT. I'm sure some of you have heard about this or seen reference to it. The P stands for practice. So some students like to take the PSAT because it is good practice, and it doesn't get submitted to anybody, even though the test itself is official in that you took it and you get an official score. You never submit it to universities or really to anyone. So it's pretty low stakes. It's not for official admissions purposes. So if your high school is giving a PSAT, you can definitely take one. And for grade 11 students, it's given in the fall. It's always in one day in October. If your school doesn't offer it, you can try to coordinate with another local school to take it. However, I can tell you that can usually be pretty challenging. And with COVID-19 and restrictions that schools have about letting other students on campus, if your school doesn't offer the PSAT, you probably just won't end up taking it. If you are a US citizen, the other thing the PSAT serves is for eligibility for the National Merit Scholarship. So in that case, you might want to speak to your Education USA advisor a little bit more if that's something that you're looking to try to qualify for. And I would suggest just learning more about it on collegeboard.org, where you can also find some practice test information. Next slide. So we're going to spend really the bulk of our time here talking about SAT and ACT. So the SAT and the ACT are really, really similar tests. Every school in the US that talks about standardized tests will say SAT or ACT. They have no preference, one or the other, doesn't matter. And they really test very similar things. Students often ask, well, why are there two of them then? Well, they're nonprofit organizations. They developed in different areas of the US. And in the past, certain schools only took certain ones. Like I grew up in California, and California was like an SAT place. The Midwest was more of an ACT place. But over time, it was like, oh, okay, well, these tests are really similar, so we'll take both. And we're now at the point where they're all widely available and everybody can choose, and it doesn't matter which one you take. And over time, they've become more and more similar tests. So they both have reading comprehension. So that's reading a passage and answering questions about it. Students will often ask, I didn't study US history and there's US history on the tests. Am I going to be at a disadvantage? No, because it's not a knowledge test. It's a reading comprehension test. So that means any information that you need to know about, let's say Benjamin Franklin, will be in the 5 paragraphs that you read about Benjamin Franklin, and then you will only answer questions based on that reading. English grammar. So there's a very small handful of English grammar terms that you will be tested on. You'll be tested on things like subject-verb agreement, on a lot of commas, comma placement, things like that. So this is one where you can usually gain a lot of points from studying, because you can start to become familiar with what it is they're testing on. Math, it's typically a grade 11 math, although I don't know your country's math curriculum, so you can work with your local advisor to see if that is true for what you're learning. But basically it's a pretty functions heavy math exam. So for most students, that's like an algebra 2 trig level in the US, or here in Canada, there's a full class called functions. So once you've taken that in your math classes, you're usually right on track for where you need to be successful on the math portion. And those are the 3 things that are the 3 main topics on the SAT. The ACT has those 3 topics as well. And additionally, the ACT has a science section. Now, just like the reading comprehension, it's not a science knowledge, it's a science reading comprehension. So you'll be given information about experiments, you'll be given data, and you need to answer questions about what you've read there in your test booklet, or I guess on your computer screen for the ACT. And then the ACT still has an optional essay. They're keeping that for now. I haven't seen any move to change that, but keep keep your eyes open. Maybe that'll happen sometime soon. I have a feeling that they'll keep it, just because the ACT is also used for some other high school exit exams in the US. So they might just keep it for that purpose. But for the most part, universities don't really look at that essay. And for a lot of institutions, most of you can opt not to take it. It's there's very few that require it at this point. The ACT website, I'm not sure whether or not, because the College Board had a list of the universities that wanted you to take the essay. I don't know if the ACT has that information on their website. So you'd have to check out act.org for that. Next slide. This is just a little more comparison between the 2. So I've already made reference to College Board and ACT. So those are their websites where you can register, you can learn more about the tests. One big difference is the way that the tests are scored. The SAT is out of 1,600. And so it's 2 sections where the minimum score is 200 and the highest score is 800. So when you show up and you sign up and you write down your name, you get 400 points, which is a beautiful gift to start with. So that's the lowest score, all the way up to 1,600. Now, of course, it's not 1,600 questions. So that is scaled based on the data received from the students who take the test that day. And the ACT is out of 36. So again, that's a scaled score. It's not just 36 questions. Whereas the SAT, you get the 2 scores and they're added together for a total score. The ACT is an average. So every section, all 4 sections, that, remember there was that science section on top of the reading, English, grammar, and math. So that's 4 sections. You get a score out of 36 for each of those sections, and then you get an average score out of 36. It's called your composite score. And so that's how the ACT works. And so oftentimes for the ACT, you're reporting your composite score out of 36. A huge difference internationally is that the SAT is still given as a pencil paper test, whereas the ACT is a computer-based test. What that means is you still go in person. You can't take it from home. You have to go to a center, but it's a center with a bunch of computers where you would take the test on a screen. Now, this has reduced the number of centers available for ACT, right? Because any center can give a pencil paper test. That's pretty easy to do, but having a full room of computers and all the requirements is not as easy to achieve. So you might find that you might not have an SAT, or you might not have an ACT available in your area. And that is the case for us here in Canada. It's a very large country, as is Mexico, where, you might be like, oh, well, there's 15 options in Canada. And then you look it up and the next one is 2 provinces away. Well, that's not really very useful. So you might find that for yourself, that even if there are options in Mexico, they might be quite far from your home or only in like larger cities. So oftentimes when students ask, what test should I take? You need to start with, well, what's available to you? The ACs, there's no point studying for an ACT if you have to, fly 3 hours to get to your closest ACT. There's also more questions on the ACT than there are on the SAT in the same amount of time. So the ACT can sometimes feel a little bit fast, particularly in the reading and science. So I know for if English is not your first language, the speed of the ACT can sometimes present a bit of a challenge. As mentioned previously, the SAT doesn't have a science section while the ACT does. They are almost identical in length, about 3 hours. That optional essay on the ACT is another 40 minutes. And then the cost. The ACT is now, it's a little bit pricier than the SAT. The SAT is going to come out to just over $100 with tax. Next slide. So as I said, really the first thing that you need to take into consideration on which test should I take is if there's even a center near you and does it have spots available, as well as are there any upcoming test dates that work for you. So those are really logistical, are oftentimes the first, that's going to maybe take the choice for you based on the logistics. But if after that you still have a choice, the other 2 things you can consider are take just a practice ACT science section and see, okay, did I like that? Was that interesting to me? Did I do well on it? Was that not interesting to me? And that could help you make a choice. Also, just the mode, right? Do you prefer a pencil paper test or a computer-based test? So for some students, that does help, particularly if you need some sort of accommodations, because the ACT is on the computer-based, the accommodations are sometimes you can access accommodations on SAT as well, but they are more accommodating on the ACT because of the computer-based test. They have 2 separate days you can sign up for, Friday or Saturday. SAT's only Saturday. So like if somebody can't test on Saturday usually for religious-based reasons, those Friday test dates are already available for the ACT. Or maybe you just if you're an athlete and you're competing in sports every Saturday, the ACT just provides a little bit more flexibility there. Next slide. So let's dive a little deeper inside the test, and we can just see a little bit more of a cross-reference on what's on each exam. We won't go too deeply into this information, but you can see the SAT starts with reading. You get a 10-minute break. You have 2 more sections and then a 5-minute break. One other big difference I neglected to mention on the earlier slide is that the SAT also has a no calculator section for math. It's a pretty short section. It just has 20 questions or 25 minutes. But you will need to take that into account when you're practicing, that you won't have your calculator for that section. MC stands for multiple choice, and GI stands for grid-in. Grid-ins are also something that is specific to the SAT. Next slide. The ACT, on the other hand, just has the one break right there in the middle. So you test for about 2 hours before you get a break. And then you finish up with your reading and science test for the last hour or so. And then if you are going to take that optional essay, you get a little short break, and then you jump right into that last section. Next slide. So if you are thinking about taking an SAT or ACT, what is your timeline? Next slide. Ideally, you would take a PSAT in grade 10 or grade 11 just for practice. Like I said, that's optional. And you could even just take one on your own. Like if you can't take an official practice test, you could just take a practice test by printing one out. You could work with your advisor in your center. Perhaps you could get a group of people together and just all do a time test together. And then if you're looking at taking an official test, I usually encourage students to take one in grade 11. So around the winter or spring is an ideal timing. Now, of course, with COVID, that is made for grade 11 students this year. I know in Canada, they haven't had any access because we had a pretty big third wave that happened. If that was the case for you, then you're probably just looking at taking your SAT or ACT this upcoming fall, which is totally fine. Because so many schools are test optional, they know as part of that students haven't had as many opportunities to maybe retake a test if they're not happy with their first score as well. In a more normal year, you usually want to give yourself time to take the test a second time, because you can improve your score. Universities will always just they'll look at the best time you took the score, and sometimes they'll even do something called super scoring. Well, they'll add together your best attempts in each section. So if you have the opportunity to test more than once, it's usually a benefit to you, not a hindrance. And even if you didn't do as well the second time, they would still kind of look more at that first attempt. Next slide. Here's some information on the upcoming tests. And I just went ahead and looked at the website. And the great news is that the registration is now open. They had said on the website for SAT that registration was going to open in July. It is not July yet, but registration is indeed open today. And ACT's registration is open as well, along with their test dates. So I didn't have the specific test dates down here when I looked this up a few weeks ago, but they are now available. So you can get on the websites, you can register, and you can see the exact test dates for 21, 22 for the ACT. Next slide. So a few study tips. Next slide. You can go all the way from free to investing a lot of money when it comes to studying. And that has a lot to do with your own needs and what makes sense for you. I'm going to give you in a moment a few questions to ask yourself on, what might be your best mode of study. So starting with free resources, on the SAT side, it's the Khan Academy that partners with College Board to give some free SAT practice content, including a bunch of practice tests. So that is a really great free resource. On the ACT side, they have something called actclub.org. It's more of like a cache of a bunch of different kind of websites and different things that help study for the ACT. So it's not that Khan Academy is like one curriculum, whereas the ACT is a little bit more of a mix of different things. So it can feel a little more chaotic, but there's a lot of good information there. Also free is the big test prep companies have some really good apps and resources that you can download and use. So Kaplan and Princeton Review are good examples where you can download their apps and do a question of the day. And so even just if you want to maybe you're in grade 10, or that you're not going to take these exams for a while, but you want to just start warming up and getting a sense of what sort of questions you might encounter, you can do that question of the day, and that will be a good way for you to start engaging with the content. Books usually cost somewhere around like 25 US dollars. So I usually encourage students to buy, especially if you're doing the SAT, to buy a book, just because it is a handwritten test. So you need to practice the way that you're going to do the test. ACT, if you purchase just an online material of some kind, that works because it's the way you would take the test. So that's fine. But I do encourage you to consider a book. So again, the big test prep companies like a Kaplan or a Princeton Review would be good for books. Barron's is also a big company that does a lot of test prep books. I've gotten good feedback from students about something called I believe it's called the Big Black Book of SAT studying, something along those lines. But that one's supposedly quite good. And if you want more College Board tests, I suggest getting the College Board book, because that would also be the just old official tests that they've given other students, just like they have on their website. But if you get the book, they're already printed out, right? So you're practicing the way that you should. Now, if you want to invest more money, there's kind of 3 different steps to that. So you could purchase paid online content that would walk you through strategies in videos, asynchronous videos. Those are usually a couple $100 US dollars. Classes, so you can consider purchasing a group class that typically meets live with an instructor. Those are going to run you anywhere between 500 to 1,500 US dollars, depending on the organization, depending on the number of times you meet, all those sorts of things. And then lastly, one-on-one tutoring is always going to be the most expensive option, and definitely an investment that can cost, several $1,000s. It depends on your goals and how long you engage in tutoring. Next slide. So how do you get started? I usually recommend starting with a full-length practice test. I know that can feel really intimidating, but it takes so much mystery out of the whole thing. Sit down for a full 3 hours, timed, do every section, score the test, and then once you've scored the test, now you can see your baseline score, what you're starting from with no knowledge. Don't study at all. From there, your score will improve, right? Like, you will do better from that point. So it's a really nice just baseline to get started, to say, okay, here's what I did well at on this test with no practice at all. Here's what I really didn't do well on because I had no idea what was going on. I need to study this for sure. So this is a good place to get started. It takes the mystery out. It helps you feel what it's like to take such a long test, and it's fast. The goal of this test is for it to kind of take exactly as long as it should. So time management is a big part of it, and you can't really prepare for that until you've felt what the timing did to you in the circumstance. So for some students, the timing can make them rush in ways that they don't usually rush when they're doing a test at school, where they get just a lot more time. So it really helps to know how you adapted to the time constraints, and then you can work on how to improve in the future. So once you have your test and your self-score, you can then see, okay, what are some range scores that I can consider? Like, what are some goal schools that are within my range, right? And then when it comes to how to then approach your studying, you're going to ask yourself some questions. All right, what score do I have right now? What is my target score? How far am I away from that score? Am I 50 points away, 100 points, 400 points? So, depending on how far you are from that score, that's going to help determine how much studying you need to do. If you're only 50 points away from your target score, then some light self-studying might be enough to just get you to where you need to be. If you're 400 points away, it's going to be a lot more work, right? You need to ask yourself, how do I usually study? And am I self-motivated? Will I put together a plan and stick to that plan? If I use all these resources available to me, will I actually follow through? Because if so, like I said, there's a lot of free resources available, that plus a book. Like you could do, I've seen students do very well on the test with just those materials, but those students are also very motivated to use all the materials. And not everybody is as self-motivated to study like that. So if you need a coach, if you need assistance, if you need somebody who's going to give you feedback, then maybe a class or something a little more structured is a better fit for you. If you like more of a group setting, an online class might be a good fit, maybe in person eventually, but I think really everything's online right now. Or if you like more one-on-one, a tutor might be a better choice. You also need to ask about how much money am I willing to invest in this process? You have to determine how important the SAT or ACT is for you and the goal school you're looking at. Earlier, we said there's still about 33% of schools that are requiring an SAT or ACT exam. Oftentimes, those schools are still requiring them because they're related to scholarships. And so they haven't taken them away because they need that information to assess what scholarship level a student is going to have. What that means is if you invest a little bit of money up front, it could pay dividends in the end. And so sometimes it's worth it to invest a little bit more in that SAT study if you know your goal school has a huge scholarship on the other side that you would then become eligible for. Let's give an example. Let's say your goal school has a presidential scholarship that if you get over 1,400, you would be eligible for. And the presidential scholarship is $15,000 a year, right? Right now, you're at a level where you would get maybe $5,000 a year. Okay, we can do the math, $40,000 more dollars to get your score up, let's say 150 points. So you have to say, okay, if I can get $40,000 more dollars, if I get 150 more points, how am I going to make that happen? What investment am I going to make to see that growth for me? With so many schools at test optional, oftentimes that's not the question anymore. Like if you're only looking at test optional schools that don't have scholarships related to SAT or ACT, then you don't really need to take it, or you don't need to invest as much time or maybe as much space on it. But if you see that you will have that very specific outcome, then it might be worth it. So that's another question. I didn't add that question here, but that is definitely another question to reflect on, is how important is the SAT or ACT in the admissions or scholarships decisions? And that's going to help you determine how much time and money you should consider investing. Next slide. So a few test taking tips. Practice is super important. This test is not like anything you've ever taken in school. You're going to be going over topics like building block topics, reading and math. These are building blocks to everything else we do in school, but they're being given to you in a way that you're not usually test. And like I mentioned before, it's in a timing circumstance that's much more of a pressure around time. So time management is one of the most critical things that you need to practice, which is not something you're used to practicing. Usually you study for a test by maybe memorizing facts or topics or creating essay outlines. But for the SAT or ACT, you need to practice timing and being efficient in how you answer questions, which means that you need to take full length timed exams, but you should also along the way do something that I call sprints. So the 3-hour test is long, right? And you don't always have time to sit for a full 3 hours, but a reading comprehension section is 5 reading comprehension pieces that when you break them down mathematically are 13 minutes each for the passage and the 10 questions. So like you can see that 13 minutes for a 5-paragraph passage, 5 to 6 paragraph passage, and 10 questions. It's kind of a lot. So you can just take one and you can time yourself on that one passage with your 10 questions and see how you do in the time frame. See what's taking you too much time and how you can be more efficient as you practice. You should consider some test taking strategies. Any book that you buy from a test prep company is going to give you some strategies, such as in the math, because you're dealing with multiple choice questions for most of the math, something like picking numbers to help you solve through an equation can help you, if you're not sure how to solve for a variable, as well as what's called back solving, which is when you take the numbers that are in the answers and use them to put them back through an equation to see what works. So you can use the multiple choice to your advantage, which in math class, you usually don't have multiple choice. So that's a skill you have to practice in a multiple choice setting. In reading, you need to make sure that you're taking notes and really doing what's called active reading. And we're not going to get too deeply into that here, but I'm sure we could share the videos of my SAT boot camps where I run, where I talk more about those strategies. I think your EduSA advisors here today are probably sharing those links with you. So basically, I have a lot of practice and information about these kinds of strategies. The thing about a standardized test is that they're completely predictable. So from test to test, these strategies make sense over and over again. And the kinds of questions, like once you take enough tests, you're going to start to see like, oh, I already saw like that exact same thing tested, just the words were arranged a little differently. So you start to become really familiar with the formatting and the kinds of questions to expect. There are no wrong answer penalties, so you should always guess. And when I say have a guessing strategy, I just mean like always choose the letter A, for example, because if you always choose the letter A when you're guessing, you should get 25% more points, right? Just by guessing. You can also use the strategy of just making sure that you cross out answer choices that you know are wrong, and that will really help you have a more accurate guess. You don't need to do questions in order, so every question is worth 1 point. So there's no point if you're having a hard time with a more difficult question, you're wasting a lot of time on 1 point, right? So it's important to skip questions and come back to them if you have time. And also, like, make sure by the end, if you're running out of time, you bubble in guesses for the ones that you didn't get to, so that you at least have a chance for some points. And yeah, easy and hard questions are all worth 1 point. I just mentioned that. So that can help you with your, again, different than a normal class, like math class, the harder questions are usually worth a lot more points, and you don't have to show your work. So you can also kind of skip steps when you're doing your work as needed. Next slide. I don't know if we have any athletes in the group, but I'm just going to briefly mention standardized tests in relation to sports. The NCAA, which is the largest athletic conference in the United States, is not requiring SAT or ACTs to compete in sports and to receive athletic scholarships in divisions 1 and 2. So if you are a highly competitive athlete looking for NCAA Div 1, Div 2, they are not asking you for test scores. Now, if the university wants them, you still need to submit them to the university. University might still want it. NCAA said, we don't care this year. So just know that just because you're an athlete doesn't mean that you don't need to take them at all. It's still up to the university on what they want as their admissions requirements, but the NCAA doesn't need it. If you're looking at NAIA schools, they are still using it as one of the things that you can submit. So that is up to you. And 2-year colleges in Division 3 and NCAA are not. 2-year colleges never need it. D3 just depends on the admissions requirements of the school. However, some coaches are still interested in seeing scores. So if you are an athlete, you're in the recruitment process, you don't know where you might go to school, I'm usually recommending right now to athletes, if you're in that place of uncertainty and have access to taking an SAT or ACT, it is a good idea just to keep all your options open. Next slide. And now I'm happy to take questions from the group. Fernanda, have people been sending you over questions?
Yes. We have one question right now. What books do you recommend for SIT and ACT?
Oh yeah, I received that question, so I made sure to describe those when I got to that slide, which was, I pointed out Kaplan, Princeton Review, Barron's, College Board, and the Black Book of SAT as 5 good options. And you can, usually Amazon is a good place to get those. If you have a huge local bookstore chain, they oftentimes will have some SAT or ACT prep materials as well.
Thank you, Jenika. We have another question. Even if the university I'm applying is not requesting the SIT, presenting a score can help me with being admitted?
Not necessarily. So like basically a school that's made it optional is really saying we're looking at this applicant holistically, and we're going to, if you don't submit it, we're just looking at all the things you did submit and we're making our decision from that information. If you do decide to submit it, we'll look at it too. I think people assume that the SAT and ACT, particularly at highly selective schools, held this like outsized role in the admissions process. So many students would focus on, okay, if I want to go to the Ivy League or I want to go to, you know, this selective school, I've got to get a perfect or a near perfect score. I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of students who've had perfect or near perfect scores that didn't get into Ivy League schools, because in the end, those schools are really committed to holistic admissions, and they really want to see what qualitative information the students are bringing. Those essays, those letters of rec, the activities list, your achievements, all of those things are really important. So if you're just looking at schools that are all not requiring it, just know that like they're always really care about those qualitative pieces. And if you're not submitting the SAT, then you're also being like really okay with them looking more deeply at those other items. So yeah, I would say for most students, I'm telling them, if you don't want to take it, fine, because you know what? You don't get points for studying for the SAT or ACT. It takes up a lot of time. I would say if you're not going to take it, think about, okay, maybe I would have spent 40 hours or 60 hours or something like that studying for this test. What extracurricular could I do instead that I can actually talk about in my application? That's actually interesting. So that would be my suggestion. And that's where you could make a real positive change from the exam to something else that you probably would enjoy doing more than a standardized test.
Thank you, Jenika. We have another question. Do you offer SIT bootcamps?
Yeah, I do. So I've run them in the past, and the recordings are available on my YouTube channel. So I can go ahead and just grab the Education USA Canada YouTube channel. There you go. So you can go ahead and take them there. The first and last session are proctored full-length tests. Like I said, that's the most important thing to get started, is really just feeling the test and practicing and doing it. So I really recommend that you engage with that. You take a full-length test before you jump into the rest of the materials. The second session is an overview of the exams. A lot of that information is stuff we went over today. Now it's 2 hours, so it's a little bit longer. There's a little more info. But if you wanted to skip that section and go right into section 3 and 4, where we talk about strategies, go for it. But yeah, I recommend taking that test first and then going right into those sections. I used to work in test preparation, so I can tell you that the strategies are legit, and any other company that you prepare with, they're going to be very similar strategies. So that's something you can access for free.
Thank you, Jenika. Someone else is asking about the subject tests. What are they, and if they can help him increase their chances to get admitted?
We're all going to say rest in peace subject tests. They don't exist anymore. So if you didn't take them, you won't ever be able to, and that is fine. For your own knowledge, if you want to know what they were, there was 20 options of various kind of core subject matter you can take in high school. They were like a final to a class. So there was a math option or 2 math options. There was an English language option, US history, world history. For the science test, there was biology, chemistry, or physics. And then there was a bunch of different language options. So, French, Spanish, Hebrew, a bunch of choices. So that's it. They were 1-hour tests to just see where you were at on what level that you were at on these certain subjects. If you did take them over this last year and you did well and want to submit them in the next cycle, you can, because the last one was given in June. So I know some students still took them. So you can still submit them, but because they now no longer exist, if you didn't take them, you can't, and they're going to be really phased out of the admissions process.
Thanks a lot, Jenika. And we have one final question. Do you recommend platforms like March to Success to practice?
What was it?
March to Success.
I'm unfamiliar with March to Success.
Yeah, I don't know it either, I think.
If you want to give a little more information, I'm happy to comment. But yeah, I mean, like I said, standardized tests are standardized. So any organization that promises to unlock the test is not doing really anything new that any other organization can do. When you take these tests over and over again, you can see how predictable they are. And that's what these test organizations are doing, is they're showing you the patterns, and each company will use different language on how to do that. It might adjust their strategy a little bit here and there. So if March to Success is an organization that provides testing strategies, then great. Just be aware if any organization is offering, guaranteeing you a certain score, or offering something that seems too good to be true. So since I don't know this organization, I can't vouch for what they do.
Thank you, Jenika. And we just got another one. If I fail the SAT test the first time, can I take it again?
So you can take it as many times as you want, and there's no such thing as failing the SAT. It's a scaled score, and you can see when you get your score report from the SAT organization, you can see your percentile. And there's certain percentiles where they indicate on the form that they believe that you have surpassed what they would say is the I can't remember the exact wording they use, but basically they have a standard of, if you're college readiness, basically. If you're above this level, you're college ready or university ready. So we use the word in the States, college and university get used interchangeably. So when you see college ready, they mean ready for a 4-year university. So I would say that's a pretty good baseline. If you're under that college readiness number, then yeah, taking it again is probably a good idea to make sure that you are meeting kind of a threshold of being ready. But you can take it as many times as you want. And also a lot of schools will use something called super scoring. Well, they'll actually look at the best times you did on each section. So maybe you did better on math the first time, better on English the second time, bring them together, super score. So it's pretty cool, usually in your best interest to take it more than once. Unless you're super happy with your score, which is great. I always tell students, study like you're going to take it once, but prepare time-wise like you are going to take it twice, right? So work really hard, try to only, get that first one in, feel like this is it. I'm going to do my best today, but have that safety valve of if it doesn't go well, that there's another test date in front of you if you need it.
Thank you, Jenika. And we keep getting more questions.
That's okay. We've got a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other way to practice for the reading section besides material, specifically designed for the SAT?
any other ways to study for reading. So number one, read. I'm sure a lot of you might spend a lot of time, if your first language is Spanish, you might spend a lot of time reading in Spanish. So I would say as much reading as you can do in English is going to help you, because a lot of time management and speed is just your ability to do reading comprehension at a certain pace. So my first recommendation is read in English, and read for pleasure, like whatever it is you enjoy reading. No matter what you read, it's going to help improve your comprehension, help improve your speed. So just on a base level, everyday things you can be doing, read. When it comes to actually practicing for the SAT, like I was saying, doing those time sprints. And if you want more reading comprehension tips, watch the session 3 of the SAT bootcamp. It's 2 full hours of reading comprehension tips. So I walk through something that I call a signposting technique. It's how you take notes. I walk students through all of that. So if you want more in-depth strategy, that would be the place to go.
Thank you, Jenika. And I think those were all of the questions.
Okay,
and thank
good.
you so much for co-hosting this session with us. And
Yeah.
it was a great pleasure to have you here with us.
Well, thank you, Fernanda, and thank you to everybody on the team. And I'm glad to see so many students participating today. I wish you all the best of luck as you take or not take an SAT or an ACT. Yeah, my last piece of advice is make a choice and go with it. Like, don't feel anxious. If you decide not to take an SAT or ACT, be confident in that choice, and then spend your time on something else. Don't give it any more brain space. Use your brain space for something else that is actually maybe even more likely to help you get into US university, like a cool project you always wanted to work on, something to do with community service, or joining that new club that you didn't think you'd have time for. So that would be what I would leave you with here on this session.
Thank you, Jenika. And everyone is invited to join our session on Tips on the TOEFL this Friday at 2 p.m. So don't forget to sign up and join us on Friday. Also, you can visit our official website in education.state.gov and follow us in all of our social networks. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.